adding to the community involvement. I think this is our 9th community meeting that we've had on the 2nd Avenue, 1st Avenue areas. And we've gotten a lot of excellent information. So my name is Ron Gobble. I am the mayor asked me and our firm to be the project managers coordinating the work down there. So we're really excited to be part of this. As many of you recall, Kimley Horn, along with Hawkins Partners and several other consultants, Wilmont, has been working, pulling together concepts and taking the ideas that you've been suggesting in the previous community meetings and trying to put those into the form of the 2nd Avenue, 1st Avenue in that district. All that following the guidelines of the Urban Land Institute and their suggestions about how we go. So we're going to go through a few slides tonight, kind of cover what some of our thoughts are. One of the things about it that we've learned is that this is really the heart of the city. So if you change things on 2nd Avenue, it is truly amazing to me how much impact it has on other parts of the city. And, you know, whether it's traffic, whether it's fire protection, whether it's sustainability or any of the other elements that all tie together. But this is the heart. It's mainly streetscape concepts. So they'll continue to evolve. Our goal right now is to get some schematics and concepts kind of firmed up in the next few months. So with that, the next slide, Michelle. You know, we all remember Christmas Day. You know, as tragic as it was, we're moving forward. We're moving in a positive direction, and we're looking forward to really making this not just one street, but that district, something that's an entity that supports itself. Next slide. We've done a lot of work. The property owners, and you'll hear more about this in a minute, are really beginning to get to the terms of what can they do and when can they do it. So there's going to be a lot of things that are coming together. It's been a little bit over 9 months, and it's a slow process, a lot of damage. And so we're continuing to move on. It not only affected 2nd Avenue, but affected 1st Avenue. And again, all of this is coming into play as we start trying to organize how do we make the street better and really make it for Nashvillians. I think the ULI report did an excellent job of articulating that we need a district for Nashvillians. So next slide. This is the map showing the damaged buildings. Actually, one red building is now turned yellow. So we're making progress. The green buildings are the ones that are essentially back open. Some still have damage. The one I live in still has damage. So every building and every building owner is different. And but we're making progress out of 65 that have been, that were affected. You know, over half are open. And the construction work is going to be going on literally for the next couple of years. Next slide. So I think my job is to hand this to Michelle at this point and let Michelle kind of get everybody up to speed.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Ron. One of the things that I just want to add to what Ron said, you know, the intention for tonight's meeting, we are going to review everything we've heard so far, who we've heard it from, and really show some concepts from the designs for what we're looking at as far as 2nd Avenue, 1st Avenue in the area. So we definitely want your feedback. So we'll have a survey at the end. We absolutely want your input. It's really imperative that we hope that everyone is one of the voices that's really going to help shape this area. So we definitely want to share that. I'm going to go through here real quick, just kind of where we've been so far. So of course, this blast happened on Christmas Day last year. Since then, Metro stepped up pretty quickly and started to conduct some listening sessions. A couple of them where we were really talking to stakeholders, those directly affected, the business owners, merchants, residents, occupants of those spaces. Those are the folks that we're going to call, you're going to hear us refer to them as the stakeholders. We've spent a lot of time and we'll continue to spend a lot of time talking to them as we refine what worked and what they would like to see in future designs for the streetscapes. We've also talked to the public a number of times, including work sessions. One of them was actually held in the snow. It was virtual, and it was probably one of the most successful virtual community meetings I've ever been to. So huge kudos to the Civic Design Center for that. It was pretty cool. Also, the mayor pretty quickly provided a grant of $500,000 to help, in the beginning stages of the recovery efforts. So that is something that the mayor and mayor's office administration has done. We've had tremendous support from all departments, all stakeholders, council members. Everybody's really been great to work together. I mean, the desire here is strong for Second Avenue. So we've held several other meetings. We've done site walks, in-person meetings, more virtual, hybrid, public versus stakeholders, design charrettes. This is actually our 9th meeting since February. So we've heard from a lot of folks. This is what some of these meetings have looked like, just FYI. If you have been a part of it, we're really thankful for that. A lot of it has been virtual. We've had a media tour so we could help provide a better idea, shed light on what's going on in the conditions of the site. We've spent time walking up and down the site with the design team and the stakeholders to really hone in on those specifics. A lot of in-person workshops, hanging over drawings, looking at some of the concepts and trying to find out what works and what could be better. So these ideas have really gone towards, we're starting to put that on paper. I mean, it started with Post-it notes and locating areas for improvements along 2nd Avenue and 1st Avenue. You can kind of see how the evolution of this is going. We're hearing some messages really loud and clear. I can say that for sure. We're hearing green space. These are actually quotes directly from the public on some of our, sorry, distracted by the pop-ups, some of our Menti surveys. So we're hearing people would really love to have a connection to the river, activate the building facades on 1st Avenue, more shops, space for locals. I mean, we're really hearing a lot of a strong message that this is something that people do not want this to be like Broadway. Broadway is great in its own sense, but there's not a desire to expand that up on 2nd Avenue. People want 2nd Avenue to be a neighborhood and have that feel and have a space for the local folks. So the more connection, the better. The buildings are really deep. Try to find something that adds interest along the way, activate. Lots of ideas and lots of desire to connect to riverfront and the river with an arcade. So we'll talk more about some of that, but these are some of the things that we've been hearing along the way. Eric, do you want to dive into some of the data?
Yeah, gladly. Thanks, Michelle. I'm Eric Koch. I'm the design director at the Civic Design Center, and we've been helping with a lot of this community engagement effort over the past few months here. So as was mentioned, this will be our 9th event. We've had over 500 people participate, and that not even including everyone here today. And then 40 or so, probably more than that even now, business owners and stakeholders and directly affected residents. So sort of some of the people who have been involved with the results. And so we also tried to pull out, we had tons of comments over the past few months, and we tried to group them into categories. So we kind of isolated some key themes, and you might recognize these categories from our book, Shaping Healthy Communities. But if you're not familiar, they are walkability and pedestrian safety, neighborhood design and development, transportation, housing, access to food resources, and open space and parks. So over what kind of majority of the comments we summarized were 40% was related to walkability and pedestrian safety. So a lot of the kind of topics that were discussed were around that kind of consistent activity along these corridors, being 1st and 2nd, and you know, continued pedestrian connections, not just to First and Second, all around to the riverfront and to the alley network and other places around downtown. And then lighting was another kind of safety element that we heard a ton about. And then neighborhood design and development, you know, that kind of looks, a lot of discussion was about kind of the all-day use of Second Avenue and First Avenue and like the historic charm that we were getting at. So those were some of the hot topics there. And then just the access to the river in regards to the open space, that was probably the kind of the top discussion points that we heard from those categories. And so we showed a lot of examples of other cities. And so actually 53% favored this completely pedestrianized example from Denver, if you're familiar with the 18th Street Mall. And then the remaining 47% favored these other examples from other cities. And so interestingly, how that kind of relates to the, if you can go to the next slide, Michelle. So looking at kind of how that related to when we showed actual designs as it related to Second Avenue, people tended to favor the coplanar or shared street example, but it was on average the most popular. So just kind of interesting how like we take inspiration from other cities, but when it comes to our street in particular with Second, that coplanar street was the most popular. And then on when we showed examples from other cities on First Avenue, the most popular one example we showed was from Savannah. And I think that what we can take from that is just the activity and the storefront facades that were so vibrant and active on First Avenue, or what people could kind of see that and how it relates to First. And then, so this is a similar slide, but shows that the data that it relates to that. And so likewise with Second Avenue, that coplanar street was again the favored on average design that we showed as it relates to First Avenue. So overall, we averaged the scores of kind of general pedestrian feeling, and on average, it was 3.5 out of 5 favored in total the more pedestrian enhancements. And so I think that's kind of the main takeaway from all the data is this district it was favorable to promote pedestrian enhancements. So with that, I'll pass it over to Nora with planning.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I'm Nora Yu with Metro Planning. I've been really happy to work closely with GHP, Civic Design Center, and all the partners on this really important project. So I'll quickly summarize here a little bit of information that came out of the ULI, or Urban Land Institute study that was done earlier, which Ron mentioned in his introduction. So in March, we actually brought ULI in. They have a special program called the Advisory Services Panel Program. And that's been a long running program where essentially they come to communities and cities that are facing some sort of important or critical land use question. And they do an intensive panel study to help make recommendations on how to move forward. So after the explosion, this was an opportunity to actually draw upon their expertise. And we got a panel of 7 experts from around the country to convene. And these are some of the themes that they kind of bring to the table, or lenses that they're looking at this situation through, and that they then make recommendations off it. What was really inspiring to us was we worked obviously closely with Civic Design Center on hosting, and also GHP, a lot of these listening and visioning sessions, even before ULI came. And what we were happy to see is, if we go to the next slide, ULI came back with findings after their intensive week-long panel. And it was really echoing a lot of what we have heard from you all, from the public. There was a lot of consistency in areas that we need to focus in on, where we should prioritize efforts. So we really felt like it was a great validation of a lot of the feedback that we've received that Eric was just kind of covering. through some of the surveys and other outreach that we've done. So yeah, generally speaking, here's some of the things that they were looking at, how do we make a successful rebuild of Second Avenue? What would that look like? How do you really tie back that this is the soul of the city? This is where the city began. So it has a historic importance and obviously adjacency of the riverfront, a very important part of downtown. We want to make sure we rebuild it in a really great way. So if we go to the next slide, these next two slides were done with our team over at Hawkins Partners, which was great. They helped compile some of the information and feedback that we have heard and kind of overlaid it on these two maps. This one is showing feedback that we had heard on First Avenue and the riverfront. And then the next slide shows feedback more based on Second Avenue. But you'll see there's, I think, again, some of the same themes mentioned by Michelle and Eric. How do we get more green space? How do we make this a space for locals, a counterpoint to Broadway? Both the park, the riverfront area, and First Avenue and Second Avenue. And I would say that was one big takeaway from ULI was when we talk about rebuilding Second Avenue, it's actually looking at this entire area. It means looking at First Avenue and it means looking at the riverfront. So that's why we've been working with our design teams on these key themes of when we rebuild the area, we're really talking about a whole, district. It's not just this block or these two blocks of Second Avenue. It's that plus the greater area. These are the key themes that came through, both through ULI, both through the feedback we've heard from the public. We kind of categorized them broadly into these 6 areas, but riverfront design, program and activation, and streetscape are the first 2. And we'll hear a little more on those today from our design teams. Historic integrity, creating connections, property opportunities, and also very important programming and operations of all of these redesigned spaces. So making them beautiful, well-designed, thoughtful spaces, but also activating them. And we understand the importance of that. Next slide. So this just shows with our key themes, kind of starting to map those out over next steps. We've had GHP really leading the effort on immediate reopening efforts, utility work, really coordinating, getting the streets back open. But in the mid to long term, this is kind of what we're all here for today. We really want to talk about some of the big picture items, and broadly, we put those into 3 categories of capital improvements, strategizing and rebuilding properties, and then again, that programming and operations piece. So with the strategizing and building property category, I want to hand it over to Dave Johnston, who is an architect with STG Design. He is working closely with the owners of properties 170 to 176 Second Avenue. Those were the properties directly across from the blast. So I would love for Dave to take over from here, and he's going to give a brief overview of some of the work that they're looking at as they look to rebuild those damaged properties.
Great, thanks, Nora. Thank you very much. Yes, we're pleased to work with the ownership of those 4 buildings. And I want to talk a little bit today, about 5 or 10 minutes on what this looks like. And Michelle, I think you have the screen. There we go. So those 4 properties were obviously damaged by the bomb in a significant way. And we can start right there. We know what it looked like on Christmas. And then we also know what it looked like across the street, and the difference between a hardened facility and buildings that were built 140 years ago. Significant impact. The next slide shows what it looked like in March when all of the debris was being removed from those buildings. And keep in mind that under that debris is the rubble that was remaining of the facades, because they were completely obliterated. And we move forward towards June, and we see the buildings cleaned out. Ron showed those earlier, and what was remaining after the bomb impact on the structure itself. The first thing that we need to do is to walk through with the Historic Zoning Commission, what are the next steps? So we met with them a couple of weeks ago to talk through how we stabilize the property. So 3 main components. The first one, the easy piece, is to repair that. There were some gutters on the backside. I shouldn't say backside, and that's a very important point. on First Avenue that was being damaged just by water infiltration. So we've repaired those gutters. On the second note, once we peeled back those walls, we put mortar across the tops of the exposed walls to help stop the further deterioration of the masonry from rain and just weather. And third, the really big component, when you look at this screen, there are a series of dashed lines that represent a grid of stabilization. Now, there are two ways to do that. We can stabilize the building temporarily on the exterior, or we can stabilize it from the interior. If you'll go to the next slide, one of the things that we're doing, this shows what those walls look like now, where we've repaired the tops of those masonry walls with a protective coating. The gutters have been sealed up with the downspouts that are on the other edge just to stop that. The next slide gives you a bit of a detail on how you start to repair these buildings from the inside. What we're doing is not only repairing it from the inside, we're going to allow the structure that we're adding to remain as the permanent structure. So basically, we have to design the new building to fit inside the old building in order to stabilize it. The next slide gives you an idea of some of the, keep going to the next one, some of the reused materials. We've saved at least 30,000 brick, as you see those palletized in the upper left. The majority of the face brick looks like that detailed picture where they were blown into pieces, which are obviously not able to be reused. The next slide shows you some photographs of the interior, the old fireplace, that scale, which apparently is fairly unique. There's not a lot of those around, and we want to be able to reuse those on the interiors of the building as we go forward. Other items such as the stone walls and the brick walls, we're doing everything we can to keep those and repair those, because those are a great value as we start looking at the character of what goes in place of the buildings that are there now. Now, most of today is about First Avenue and Second Avenue, and how do we make the connection between the two? And as we visualize what revitalizing this property is about, the collaboration efforts between Michelle's group, with Ron, with Historic, with Tim Walker, with Cyril Stewart, with Historic Zoning, along with Nora and her group at Planning, and Lucy, we had several meetings where we collaborated on what can we do with this property to pull all of these pieces together. Taking the ULI report that was done, one of the most important pieces is that yellow slot that you see across the page right now. That is the building that was the shortest, but it was blown all the way through. So it made, fortunately for us, it allowed us to look at how do we make a connector. It's fairly obvious that we could use that property to connect First Avenue and Second Avenue. All the shots we see on television, especially on Monday night, for instance, you see front street, you see the First Avenue of Nashville. That becomes our new front porch. It's always been there. It's not going to change. How do we restore that and connect the people, not only to the river, but to First Avenue and to Second Avenue? So part of the process that we're going through is getting approval that we've received approval from the Historic Zoning Commission to move to the next step. Part of that next step is to use what we call an SP, a specific plan. By doing that, that allows the owners of the property to disclose what their plans and intentions are for the property to the public. What the owners have decided to do is to actually limit the use of that property where it is there is no surface parking allowed. So we will go back with, as you see, what that Second Avenue facade looked like on December 24th, and try to do as much as we can to recreate that without matching it in a Disneyland approach. The next slide shows you our concept of what this would look like. Now, keep in mind, those are gone. Those facades are gone. The owners would like to go back with a 4-story brick facade that matches its neighbors. It's in keeping in material and scale and proportions with the rest of the buildings, with the addition, if you want to call it that, of an opening that connects First Avenue to Second Avenue. that opening is live. It's an address. It's retail. It's restaurant. It could be a pop-up retail shop, but it is an active 30-foot wide strip that does go from first to second. Now that's a 17-foot drop in elevation, so there'll be steps. It'll be terraced as you go through that space. Ultimately, what the developer, the owners of the property would like to do is to develop it into a hotel. That's what they've done in the past. They do on a lot of the properties that were mentioned before by Eric in Savannah, and reusing the materials, the facades across the front, the old cast iron storefronts, to refurbish those and recreate those as much as possible. The next is when we look at it from First Avenue side, there's a close-up of what that connector looks like. These buildings as they exist today, well, say on December 24th, we want to keep that almost exactly the way it is. The building on the left is 170. We will restore it, put in new windows, touch up some of the masonry work, and keep it just as it is. The two on the right have a severe structural element that is critically damaged, about an 8-inch bow in the building. So we're going to actually take it down piece by piece and then put it right back up with some newer techniques that keep it much stronger. It'll last another 140 years. So in essence, you can see it looks exactly the way it did, with the added advantage of another 140 years of service, and opening the street facades up to sidewalk cafes, the connection through back up to Second, and a hotel use. Next slide shows some of the notes about what that could look like, and really as much of the preservation of the materials that we can do. Next slide is a zoom in, I believe, of that, where you do have storefront, you have cafe dining in that space. The next slide shows some historical precedent for what those spaces could look like, with steps, with cafes, with storefronts, but it's an active public space. It really becomes a destination, not just simply a connection. When we think about what those spaces would look like on the interior of these buildings, the next few slides go through what those materials would be. It's a boutique hotel. It's that with restaurants and retail that really fits in with the neighborhood. And you can see how that starts to reflect some of the hotels and some of the work on 4th and 5th Avenue. It's a different feel than what you see on Broadway, but it still has that natural Nashville feel. And we'll call that authentic Nashville. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Michelle to talk through the 1st and 2nd Avenue pieces.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's exciting to see that come together. And just real quick, a reminder, some of those key themes that we've heard from the community, from stakeholders, and from ULI are creating connections from 2nd Avenue to 1st Avenue in the riverfront, activating riverfront, activating 1st Avenue so that it, there's desire to go and play on that side of the street, and then also maintaining that historic character. And so really, I think that, going through the process that Dave and his group and the building owners have been going through have really been able to keep all of those key themes in mind. And so, this is a really positive thing, I think. Of course, Nashville's really good at turning a difficult situation into something amazing. So this is no exception to that. It's nice to see. Do want to spend a moment and introduce the design team. So we've talked a little bit about these designs. We're going to get right into 2nd Avenue and 1st Avenue, and then moving into the park area. We want to introduce Kimley Horn. They've been an instrumental part of the conceptual stages here, and it's been really great. We've had folks from both the Atlanta office as well as the local office. We also have Hawkins Partners, which most of you probably know and love. Kim Hawkins and her team, Nathan Oliver, have been wonderful and will continue to participate in a lot of the visioning for this. And then, of course, Tiffany Wilmot Inc. has been included and providing the sustainability design, as well as, our lots of conversation about trash and waste management. And that's something that in order to activate First Avenue, that's a huge component that needs to be solved and reworked. So that's a really important conversation that will continue to ongo. So I'd like to kick it over now to Eric Bossman with Kimley Horn.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thanks everybody for joining us this evening. This really is exciting now to be able to take all this fascinating and wonderful input that you've gathered over the last 10 months and now start to put some visuals to it for what can Second Avenue, First Avenue, the riverfront become over the next coming years. So you've heard a lot of the background this evening about the input that's been gathered. And that really was our starting point as we looked at how do we recover and rebuild Second Avenue? How do we take all of the design input and those concepts and put it into words and in designs that start to bring Second Avenue back to life? And so as Eric talked about earlier, there was a lot of conversation in the previous meetings about creating more pedestrian space. How much of this street, Second Avenue specifically, historically had 4 lanes of 2 lanes of parking, 2 lanes of traffic that were given to automobiles, and about 28 feet of the street that were given to pedestrians and sidewalk activities. How do we rethink that in a way where we really maximize Second Avenue for pedestrians? And you heard Michelle say it, you've heard Dave reference it as part of the architecture piece. How do we make sure that we maintain the celebration of the history of Second Avenue? And at this point in time, that's both Second Avenue's founding as part of the birthplace of Nashville, but also the recent history that we've experienced as well. How do we continue to maintain that traditional architecture, that sense of place, but also recognize Second Avenue's role within downtown and the greater Nashville area? I think we also heard pretty clearly through the input sessions that one of the things that made and makes Second Avenue unique is the tree canopy. It's something that really was a prominent feature, is a prominent feature of Second Avenue and sets it apart from many of the downtown streets. So what you'll see this evening is that all of our design thoughts maintain that tree canopy and or consider where it may need to be enhanced or replaced within portions of the corridor. And we know that no matter what we do in the future, our needs are going to change. So if we're going to make a 30-year or 40-year, 50-year investment in Second Avenue, we have to design for flexibility. We have to think not only about the way that our corridors work today, but the way that this street may work in the future and the flexibility to adapt and to change for generations to come. And while there was a tremendous amount of conversation about, can we do 100% pedestrian street 24/7, 365? In meeting with a lot of the local business owners and operators, we have to acknowledge and recognize that there's a need to maintain some level of circulation, as well as loading, valet, and drop-offs on the street. Now, while we do recognize and acknowledge the need for all of that, we also think there are ways we can tweak it. And you might notice that on-street parking is not included in that list. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit this evening as well. So what I want to do is walk you basically through some design options and alternatives that are currently under consideration. And then later in the evening, when we get to the Menti, we're going to get your input on some of the elements of those different variations within the alternatives. Now, if we start at the South Block, so Broadway's on your right, Commerce Street on your left on the graphic, if we went down and said, how far can we go with pedestrianizing the street? Well, we may be able to make it a pedestrian street and close it down for some periods by putting in some methods that we can close it down on a temporary basis. But if we're going to maintain the opportunity for flexibility, for adaptability, and frankly, for public safety, there's probably a minimum level where we need to incorporate at least the opportunity for 2 travel lanes. Now, we think in looking at some of the traffic numbers that the street really doesn't need 2 travel lanes all of the time. And in particular, if you're going to close down the street, obviously sometimes those won't be travel lanes. In the most extreme sense, we think you could probably do it in a way where you've got 1 lane that's dedicated to travel and maybe 1 lane that's a flex lane. And that becomes your loading zone or your valet or your Uber Lyft drop off. Regardless of how far we go, we definitely want to tame the street and give back more space to pedestrians. So even if we maintained 24 feet for 2 travel lanes, whether they're used as travel lanes or not, that gives us the ability to widen our sidewalks from about 14 feet today to between 20 to 25 feet on a permanent basis all the way up and down the street. And in this design, you're seeing all of the existing street trees maintained in the South Block because we're able to do so. Now, in all frankness, when we met with the local property owners, the local businesses, there's some concern about that. So we ticked it up to the next level. What if we include some loading zones just on the east side of the street? Again, not parking areas, loading zones. So that's where the loading could happen during the day, where the valet, the Uber Lyft drop off could happen during the evening. We could get them off to the side a little bit where they're not clogging up the 3 lanes. But again, keeping that street as narrow as possible and widening the sidewalk as much as possible. So we don't want loading lanes or drop-off lanes that go all the way up and down the block, but carefully selected and strategically located to meet the need. And when we look at it this way, it definitely is weighted towards the east side of the street. So there's one more shot at it in alternative 3 that looks at alternating loading zones to the left and the right, the east and west side of the street. Again, we're trying to minimize those. We're trying to carve as much space as possible for the sidewalks, for pedestrians, for street side dining. But in order to meet the public safety demands and concerns and some of the logistical concerns, we are allowing for up to 2 lanes, even though we may create additionally those mechanisms to close the lanes off when you want to make the street fully pedestrianized. So the next image shows basically what 2nd Avenue looked like the previous year. And then with these considerations and design concepts that we're talking about, what it could look like in the future. Again, we're trying to narrow these lanes as much as possible. Eric talked about the potential for a coplanar street. That is an option here. We do have some stormwater issues that we need to work through. So even if it's not coplanar, what you're seeing in this concept drawing is actually an angled, not quite a rolled curb, but sort of an angled curb that sort of provides that same sense that the sidewalk is more closely aligned to the street level so that when it is closed down, there's the opportunity to create that pedestrian space. But again, maintaining flexibility as we go through the options. So that's how we've started to translate some of this information into the South Block. When we get to the middle block, we actually think there's a pretty exciting opportunity that because the west side of the street, the left side or the bottom of the plan graphic that you're looking at has a lot of the AT&T buildings that does not have street level activity. We actually think there's an opportunity to move the street a little bit to the west, particularly when we're narrowing it down. We can move it to the west and actually further maximize the sidewalk space, the sidewalk dining, the activity on the east part of the street. And with the architecture that you saw previously and the ability to create this cut through between 2nd and 1st Avenue, we think there's also an opportunity to create a public plaza or a public space in the middle of the block. We heard many business owners talk about that even prior to the events of last year, a lot of the activity starts at Broadway and might make it up to Commerce. But then when you go from Commerce to Church Street, the activity really drops off pretty quickly. We believe that creating this urban plaza not only will create this moment that calls more attention to the crossover between 2nd and 1st, to some of the recent history that's occurred in the area, but also create a focal point that will draw more individuals, more patrons up the street, further into 2nd Avenue, and bringing more attention to the businesses and the opportunities that are there. Now, at the end of the day, the curve may not be as severe as what we're showing here. What we're talking about is really moving the street to the west. There's a variety of different geometries we can use to do that. We just have to meet up at Commerce and Church to make sure that our alignments work. And if you don't like that particular look at the plaza is definitely something that is open for discussion and further design consideration. So taking part of an arched approach, part of a more geometric square approach that maybe has some light towers or light elements within it. We've got 2 more on the next slide that even goes into different ways to begin to look at and conceptualize and design. So the plaza is far from finished. Part of the input we want from you tonight is whether the plaza is a good idea in creating that public space within Second Avenue, this point of remembrance, but not remembrance of a negative thing that happened, a celebration of the spirit, the enduring spirit of Nashville and of the people of Nashville that are embodied in what is being recreated and rebuilt along Second Avenue. So in addition to that thought for the plaza, as we go to the North Block, then we start to sort of return again to some of the ideas that we talked about on the South Block, narrowing the street as much as possible, widening the sidewalk environment. We also think, you know, the porous nature of Second Avenue and being able to reconnect it to First into the riverfront is so important. And Bankers Alley and Bank Street provide yet another opportunity to do that, where we can potentially provide a raised intersection that not only slows the traffic, calms what few cars will be there, but really creates this pedestrian moment and this pedestrian space across the intersection. We could also do that treatment at Commerce and at Church Street as well, frankly, where we raise the intersection and again, are changing the balance between vehicles or any sort of motorized aspect and the pedestrians whom we're really trying to create the space for. And on the North Block, there are 6 trees that remain. In order to really reestablish that canopy, we could actually replant the North Block entirely. And by doing that, move the trees a little out towards the center line. The sidewalks are actually much, much more narrow in this North Block than they are in the other 2 blocks. So the second alternative for the North Block replants all of the trees and moves them in towards the center line. Again, trying to create that sense of canopy and maximizing the space for the pedestrians. So one more view just that gives you an idea of what that raised intersection. This is an example from Portland, but you can see how it starts to change the environment and the balance between pedestrians and other users within the corridor. So that's a little bit of the progress that we've made in translating some of the design input to Second Avenue. Again, I want to highlight as I hand it over to Nathan to highlight what's going on First Avenue. The idea here is really not just a single corridor. This is about really transforming this entire section of downtown, linking the riverfront to First to Second and through Bank Street and the proposal of 172 Second Avenue and Butler's Run, the opportunity to really create a greater sense of collaboration between Second Avenue and the environment on First Avenue and create a destination in downtown Nashville that builds off of its historic presence, but is very, very different from the Broadway environment and caters to a very different population within the city. Nathan, you want to take it from there and talk a little more about First?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. It's great to be with you all here tonight. My name is Nathan Oliver. I'm with Hawkins Partners, and we've been working with the rest of the design team and the project team and really looking closely at First Avenue as part of this work. And we've taken a lot of the feedback that you all provided throughout this time, throughout all these different public meetings and engagement opportunities that we've had. And a lot of those were mentioned in some of the work that Eric was describing. And taking some of those and really looking at First Avenue and applying those in a way that can make it a more transformative space. Some of those that really came out as themes that were mentioned: dining facing the river, a pedestrianized street, an environment that's much more about walkability, pedestrian safety, and connectivity in a way that really activates First Avenue. As Dave kind of mentioned, these buildings are really unique because they really have 2 fronts. Front Street or First Avenue is really an opportunity to front Riverfront Park and to front the river. And so as we begin to look at the opportunities, there's an opportunity to really think about activating these and allowing them to be more of a front. And so what these concepts, or what this concept shows, what we heard was, let's look at how we can pull the street away from the building to create a pedestrian experience along the building, where we can provide opportunities for that activation to take place. And what you see in the yellow boxes along the facade is what we're calling a flex zone, because that's a zone where there's a number of different active things that can happen. That can be dining, that can be retail that spills out onto the street. There may be a need where there's a valet lane for the particular business, or some type of service that needs to be accommodated within that space. And so that flex zone represented in the sections that you see across the bottom provides the opportunity for that activation to occur along the buildings. And then from that flex zone, we expand the pedestrian sidewalk space that you see kind of along there between that street to allow a stronger pedestrian connectivity in a pedestrian environment. And then that spills out onto a shared street space. And this is an opportunity, much like Second Avenue, that we can really look at prioritizing the pedestrian. So there's a strong connection across First Avenue to Riverfront Park, and that really allows that connection to really be stronger from Second Avenue through these places that you see highlighted here, Butler's Run and the 172, and really creating a block that's much more connected as a whole. And so the way that we address this street is thinking about these ways to expand that pedestrian connectivity and create an environment that's much more active to the uses that are going to be there. The other thing that you'll notice on the other side of the travel lanes, we have maintained the 2-foot travel lanes. You'll see they've narrowed down a little bit, but maintain that connectivity through there. On the other side, you'll see a wider shared promenade as well to really enhance the connectivity and to think about the future options in ways that it can connect to Riverfront Park. The 172 Second Avenue connection really presents a great opportunity to create a little bit of a node and a plaza there. And as it lands at the north side of Fort Nashboro and at the north end of Riverfront Park, again, is one of those ways to activate the space and activate the streetscape. Go to the next slide, if you will. And so as we begin to think about what can happen within these spaces, you'll see that flex zone that we were just talking about, described in a little bit more detail. Begin to think about some of the uses that can start to occur along this facade and things that will begin to provide that activation in a way that the building can really start to engage the street and the pedestrian engage the building as well. And then Michelle, you can go to the next one. And then again, this is really looking again back at the work that Dave talked about and that connection at 172 that we were just speaking of. And again, thinking about some of the opportunities to create an atmosphere and a character along here that's really representative of a lot of the things that we heard and a lot of the things that people are looking for and how they want to First Avenue to really embrace this idea, this block and this active node here right in the heart of Nashville. All right, and then one more. Coming up here. And then this is just a character rendering to kind of start to describe a little bit of what we were just seeing in plan. And sometimes it's hard to really visualize when looking at it from the top and in a plan view, what that kind of experience and character may be. And so this is kind of starting to put a little bit of illustration to what that environment could be. You'll see that kind of active zone along the building, flex zone that bleeds into a pedestrian space. And then this really starts to convey this idea. This is really about a pedestrian experience. So we're prioritizing the pedestrian and really encouraging the active nature along it, north and south and east and west across the connection. And that can come in a number of different ways that we think about the treatment of First Avenue, the pavement type, as Eric was talking about, opportunities of a rolled curb, opportunities that were spoken to earlier of a coplanar street. So those types of ways we need to change the character of the street, change the way in which the vehicle interacts with it, and start to prioritize what we all have been saying and hearing during this whole experience is it's about the pedestrian and the people that are within this space. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany to talk a little bit about some of the sustainability features along the block.
Thanks, Nathan. And thank you everybody for being here tonight. I just have 2 slides and I wanted to talk a little bit. I'm Tiffany Wilmot with Wilmot Incorporated, and we are on the team to make sure that sustainability is incorporated into all the designs. And as you know, sustainability is not just environmental, although that's a big part of it. It also has people, so the social side of things, and profit, so the money side. So the economics of it is important too, so that we can be sustainable and continue on doing what we want to do. So in getting feedback from everybody, these are some of the things that we heard, some of the top things, and they're not in order. happening and heat happening, there are fewer and fewer trees that will be able to be used in Nashville. So for instance, nobody's planting, or people shouldn't be planting red maples anymore. So we have fewer trees, but we're looking at trees that are gonna last and be something that we'll have for a long time. We're gonna go horizontally. So we'll talk about environmentally friendly building materials and local materials. So this is a way to save money. Local, of course, saves money if you're buying something that's 20 miles away versus 1,000 miles away. You're going to save money on transportation and probably get your materials more quickly. We're also looking at using environmentally friendly materials. So instead of going to the rock quarry and buying virgin crushed stone, we can take concrete and crush it ourselves and get it for about half the price. You've heard a lot about sidewalk widening and improved sidewalk usage. So I'm not going to talk about that much, but that is part of the people, planet, profit. That's part of the people side in giving pedestrians a bigger ability to use the street. We're being really careful about birds, just because that's a difficult subject. We want to provide habitat, but we also don't want, we have to keep our streets clean. So that's something we're considering. And then making sure that as we increase biodiversity, we also are being careful about use of herbicides and pesticides. Of course, limiting traffic flow is important, and that gives more of our emphasis on PEDs. And with green rooftops, that's kind of a catch-all phrase. That could be white roofs, it could be reflective roofs, or it could be green roofs. That can be a wildlife habitat. It also decreases stormwater costs. It insulates buildings. It soundproofs them, and it gives us another space. Sometimes people can use green roofs as another floor of their building. The next row is recycling and composting. So we are, it's really important to us to make sure that we get recycling into what's happening with our waste, and composting. So if we can get the food, the putrescible, smelly part out of the trash and separate that, not only can we recycle it and compost it for reuse, we also reduce the odors downtown. There's less leachate on the ground, and it's a really heavy waste that we can keep out of the landfill. And as most of you know, the landfill is going to be closing. The one we use in Murfreesboro is going to be closing in the next couple of years. So anything we can get out of that waste stream will save us money long-term as our waste rates are going to increase, probably by quite a bit. I'm going to go next to shelters and canopies. That's again providing shelter, rest areas, but also shade as we have heat island effect. And that's the effect of, when you drive downtown, it's about 5 or 10 degrees hotter, depending on where you're coming from, with all the concrete holding the heat. So anything we can do to provide lighter colors and shading for people, and it'll keep the buildings cooler also. We're looking at solar for buildings and lighting. We have, thanks to Councilman O'Connell, we have a 100% renewable mandate, a renewable portfolio standard to get to 100% renewables. So that's something that's really important to us. And now that solar is the cheapest option, it's the cheapest fuel of any fuel, it's cost effective as well. The open public plaza provides gathering spaces, increased livability, and it's something that we heard from a lot of people. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the street planters and pervious pavement. So we have on Second especially a lot of underground utilities and basements where we may not be able to do rain gardens or pervious pavement. So on Second, we're looking at street planters to keep, we can put small trees in there, shrubs and flowers, anything like that. And then on First, we can probably do pervious pavement to help drain to help drainage and maintain some of our water. Next slide, please. And then here are just a few pictures of some of the things we're talking about. In the top left, you see the street trees that we've been talking about, as well as specialty planters. There are lots of different options for planters, and that helps with protecting pedestrians from cars, as well as bringing beauty and some fresh air to downtown. Waste handling on the right, there are lots of different options for containers. We're looking at potentially on 2nd Avenue, having containers that will provide different recycling options. They'll be labeled, we'll make sure they're colored so that people know what to do. And then on 1st Avenue, that'll be back of house for the owners. And we're looking at consolidating some of the waste so that not everybody has to have their own container. The middle picture is heat reducing pavement and carbon sequestration with the heat island effect that we talked about earlier. We can reduce the heat by putting in lighter colored or reflective pavement. And there's new concrete now that has carbon sequestering properties, so we can sequester some carbon in the